Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. And there's some evenings, when we hold our think-ins where you feel you really want to interrogate the subject and the people that are joining us. And there are sometimes you just want to press play. And with David Frum, I have to say, the thing I really want to do is go start and I'll catch up at the end of the hour. Because David is that very, very rare, I think probably only thing, unique thing, which is someone who has sat really at the heart of American politics, particularly Republican politics, best known as a speechwriter for George W. Bush. I covered that presidency when I was at the FT and would have loved to have had an hour with David Frum, but someone who sat at the heart of that politics and then emerged now as an uncompromising writer, commentator on what's happening in American and Republican politics too, and has authored a book, Trumpocalypse, about restoring American democracy that, if you like, is a game of two halves. Half of it is the reckoning, a tally of what the Trump administration have done to America and American democracy, and then a set of ideas, progressive ideas, I think even by his own account, progressive ideas of what America could or should do next. And so I hope in the course of this next hour, we'll hear on all of those things from David Frum. My colleague, Matt Dancona, is here too and knows him well. So I hope we'll hear from Matt too. And by the way, this is a think-in. So the aim is that we hear from everyone else too. So please do, say what you think in the chat. Put your thoughts to David. I'll make sure that as many people as possible can speak to him in the course of the hour. So please do weigh in. We're looking forward to a really lively conversation. And David, why don't we start with the reckoning? When you tally up the impact Trump has had on the United States, how should we understand what he has done?
Well, first, James, thank you for your hospitality and your generous words. I hope it is not true that I can monologue for an hour, but I fear it may be. How do we begin with the reckoning? First, there's the very dramatic and immediate reckoning we see all around us, which is the horrifying failure to deal with the coronavirus, a problem for the whole world, but worse in the United States than almost anywhere. And worse in the United States with almost less excuse than anywhere because we had so much notice. Along with that terrible virus has gone a horrifying economic collapse. Again, that's not unique to the United States, but it has been uniquely badly handled here. We have not put a floor under our people. We have put a floor under a very few powerful institutions, companies. They've been protected. Most of the population faces a very great hardship that is about to get dramatically worse. Until there have been emergency income supplements put in place in the CARES Act passed in March, they expire at the end of July. And at the end of July, what happens to those Americans who are out of work, it really staggers the imagination. My book was revised in time for COVID, but most of it was written before COVID. And so the reckoning I am there concerned with are deep changes to American institutions that Trump did even before the disease struck. And in particular, the way our system of checks and balances really signally failed. It is, of course, always true that elections exist and that at 4-year intervals, the people can replace the president. The theory of American democracy, the theory that put so much power into the hands of a president, so much different from a prime minister or a chancellor, was that we had other systems in between elections that would work to constrain the president. And those systems failed one by one. Let me just deal one example before monologuing too much longer, and that is the failure of the Congress. The idea is that it is the Congress that supervises the president, oversees him, as we say, by getting documents, by calling his people to be questioned. President Trump has taken the position that he will not submit to questioning by any House of Congress not controlled by his political allies. He'll take some questions in the Senate, but none from the House. Now, that's a constitutional revolution. And he has mostly gotten away with it. And he got away with it again just a couple of days ago at the Supreme Court.
So David, I'd love to talk a little bit about those checks and balances. I want actually, if I could, to start with the judiciary and the courts. And let's come back to Congress in a moment, because one of the things that's really unclear is the extent to which this erosion of the independence of the judiciary is working, or as a political device, as a talking point, as a rallying point for his supporters? How much is actually changing?
The judiciary is not one of the sickest institutions. If you were to rate the Americans, the military has done best. The prestige press has done very well. The courts are sort of in the middle. The federal bureaucracy and Congress have done extremely badly. And the true mass media of the United States, Facebook, YouTube, companies like that, are there in the basement along with Congress and the federal bureaucracy. What the courts reflect is the devil's bargain that the institutional Republican Party has made with the Trump presidency. Most judges, there are some judges whom Trump has appointed who are truly Trumpy, but most of them are standard issue conservative Republicans who have gone along with him because he's delivered. But we saw just last week in a Supreme Court decision called Mazars, which is about the Trump tax record, how John Roberts, the Chief Justice, who's by no means Trumpy, probably doesn't have a lot of regard or respect for Donald Trump, nonetheless protected Donald Trump's records through the federal election, which is the only thing Donald Trump cares about. Trump delivers reinforcements to Roberts-type Republicans, and Roberts delivers protection to Donald Trump. So we have some Trumpy judges, but mostly a complicit rather than a completely Trumpized judicial system.
I suppose I was asking you because I'm not sure that we get, living here in a way in which we would living there, just quite how visceral a moment the Roger Stone story has been for Americans and for a sense of justice in America. I just wonder whether you could explain how you see it. I suppose the most recent example, or the most recent addition to that reckoning.
Well, the President of the United States has a power to pardon federal offenses. And one thing I should stress, and probably most of you know that, is we have two legal systems in the United States, federal and state. And the state system is much larger. Most people who are charged with crimes, most cases flow through the state system, and which has its own problems. The federal judicial system is a smaller section that deals with the most serious crimes and deals with the largest civil cases. The president, for people who are convicted of federal crimes, has a power to pardon offenses. That means he completely expunges the record of it, and to commute sentences. If your sentence is commuted, you're still guilty, but you don't go to prison. And that has some interesting implications for the Stone case, which we can get to in a minute. This is a power that is left over to the president from the British and English kings of the 18th century. And it's a royal prerogative, and it sort of sits uneasily in a democratic system. And so the way we've dealt with it over the past, really since Watergate, has been that we've bureaucratized it. Most presidents don't do their pardons themselves. There's an office in the White House. There's an office in the Justice Department that sorts requests for pardon, and then it picks meritorious cases and forwards those to an office in the White House. And the White House office then sifts them and then comes up with recommendations, and the president says A or nay. And frankly, any normal president, the pardon power is a nuisance, because what it means is people are always bothering you and asking you for pardons, and that's not really your job in the 21st century. And normal presidents, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, frankly, if they could get rid of it, they would, because it's just a tax. But Donald Trump has used it as a political weapon in a way that's really unprecedented, at least in the modern history of the United States. In the case of Roger Stone, here was someone who's a lifelong ally of Donald Trump's, knows secrets of the Trump political operation going back to the 70s. Stone he's such a ridiculous person, it's hard to take him seriously as a criminal mastermind, but he and Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign manager, were career business partners and who represented all kinds of sinister, evil people all over the planet. Manafort made an enormous fortune, Stone made rather less. And then Stone became sort of this presence in the Trump campaign, where he volunteered to be the go-between between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks, which, as you know, James, WikiLeaks is the Russian state. So when you are going between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks, you're going between the Trump campaign and the Russian state. Now, exactly how all of that played out, that's a complicated story. I don't have to tell it here. But the point was, Stone got into terrible trouble. He lied to Congress in order to protect his role as a go-between. He threatened a witness, again, in a completely crazy Jeremy Thorpe-like way, but it was a real threat to a witness to silence the witness. And when he was going to jail, just before he went to prison, he was convicted. Just before he went to prison, he said to reporters, if Trump does not pardon me, I have things I can say. He blackmailed the president, and the president then delivered the commutation. Now, the difference in a commutation and a pardon, if Stone were pardoned, he could never be charged with these matters again, which means he would lose his Fifth Amendment right to refuse to answer questions from prosecutors. Because the sentence was commuted, that Stone is still in legal jeopardy, which means he still has his Fifth Amendment right and he can refuse to answer questions. So giving him the milder relief, which looks like some kind of concession, is actually part of the criminal scheme to keep Stone quiet.
Right. Okay, that's fascinating, Dave. Listen, I'm going to bring some people in a moment, but I wanted to ask you one thing, particularly on the reckoning side, because I'm interested in your hierarchy. And actually through the book, in the first half of the book, it's really clear, you know, it echoes that point about how many different institutions and organizations get compromised along the way. The one that I'm intrigued about is the Republican Party and your understanding of why there hasn't been a meaningful resistance within the Republican Party to Donald Trump.
The core of the problem, and this is, I'll put this in terms that maybe are familiar to a British audience. So historically, at any given moment, the United States has not a two-party system, but a 1.5-party system. One party is usually the stronger party of the two. And from the Nixon era through the end of the Cold War, the Republican Party was the stronger of the two parties. That didn't mean it couldn't lose. Watergate comes along and it lost badly, and Jimmy Carter became president. Most of the time, federal, state, and local, the Republicans had the upper hand, and we had a pretty conservative polity between about 1968 and 1990. Since 1990, the Republicans have tended to lose ground, and it took them a long while to understand what was happening to them. And they thought that they were just not activating their voters, not appealing to their voters enough. And so they tended to become more radical. And especially after 2008, they became much more radical, thinking that's the way to energize our people. But what they had to confront, and 2012 was losing to Barack Obama was a real consolation, was the country's changed in ways that make the Republicans less powerful than they were in the 1980s and 1990s. We have more minorities, and we have a lot more college-educated people. And especially we have a lot more college-educated women who vote for parties of the center-left, phenomenon you see throughout the world. So one way to respond to that is the way that David Cameron did in the United Kingdom. Well, let's adapt our conservatism to fit the new country. And that's normally the way competitive political parties work. The Republican Party instead said, and the circumstances of the 2010s made this possible, let's shrink the electorate to fit our agenda. In fact, let's keep a radical agenda and let's shrink the electorate. That had been something that Republicans were doing, but without really admitting to themselves they were doing. But Donald Trump is the crystallizing moment where it's become clear. The strategy is to compete by shrinking the electorate, not by adapting. And Trump offered a vision of how that could work. It was a little bit of an illusion. And I think that's part of the reckoning of 2020, is if the Republican defeat is as big as right now it looks like it will be, Republicans are going to have to rethink. And one of the things that could be optimistic about the future is a big enough defeat for the Republican Party knocks it off this course of trying to be radical but shrink the electorate, and forces it back onto the path of being a proper electorally competitive Democratic Party of the center-right for the 21st century.
So I think we definitely want to come to that, because that's at the heart of it. And I know one of the reasons why Matt and I were so excited about you coming and having this conversation, David, was to try and understand what that would look like, what those changes in the rules and systems were like. It's interesting, the conversation already in the chat as you were speaking is a lot about, inevitably, who wins, what happens in November. I'm going to bring a couple of people in, but I was really interested, would you just explain, there's a piece you wrote for The Atlantic, I think, I can't remember exactly when, it must be in the last few weeks, about the Trump strategy from here to November, what he does. So do you want to talk about that too? And then I'm going to bring in a couple of people who've got questions about whether and how Biden might win.
Well, the raw numbers for Trump are terrible and getting worse all the time. As you'd expect, people are sick, people are dying, people are out of work, and a lot of their income support, and those numbers are going to get worse, because after July 31st, as I said, the supplemental unemployment insurance, which has cushioned the blow for a lot of people. We've had a terrible increase in joblessness. We've not yet seen a big drop in consumer spending. And that's because people have been getting a special supplement. The unemployed get $600 extra, or $600 a week extra from the federal government. And that's the equivalent of a $15 an hour pay. That's enough to keep people eating and buying shoes and keeping up with the necessities of life. It's not luxurious, but it gets you by. That ends, and Trump's numbers will drop after that. So the strategy has been one of, first, illusion. Don't acknowledge that we have a terrible disease, pretend it's not there, try to drive people back to work, try to drive children to school. And then the real sort of right hook lurking behind the ear is to make it more and more difficult for people in Democratic groups to vote at all, to shrink the electorate and to try to constrain who's able to vote, where they're able to vote. This is a thing, if you're not familiar with American politics and you're used to other democracies, it's incredible. But local politicians are able to place voting machines where they want, according to where they think it will do them most good. So you can put lots and lots of voting machines in, if you're a Republican politician, in white affluent areas and have one machine to serve an entire county of black voters and create queues. I now forget where I read this, but a credible estimate is that the average black voter waits 45 minutes longer to vote each time than the average white voter does.
And just when you say, the thing that's really unclear to me, that's decided in the governor's mansion. It's the state governor that has counties
at the county level. Governors have a role, but it is our electoral system is highly localized, and each county decides what its own ballot is going to look like. Each county decides where voting machines go. Governors have a say. Usually an informal one. The state level politicians have, obviously, they have telephones. They can talk to the county level officials, but it's at the county level. We don't have, and we don't really have an enforceable national right to vote. And to the extent that we did, the Supreme Court dismantled it in 2013.
So, and sort of the brass tacks on that is, in the mix of counties, could you conceive of a way in which those decisions at a county level could so significantly skew the outcome that you could run a strategy that was get out your base vote for Trump and deter enough Democrat votes that you can get over the line, even with these differences in the public opinion polls?
And that's Trump's core problem, and the reason why I think Trump has plans the thing to understand about the Trump operation is, at its core, are fanatics, crooks, and morons. And there's a constant struggle to get the upper hand. Usually the crooks win, but sometimes the morons win. And one of the ways that, for example, the campaign manager who was just fired, Brad Parscale, one of the ways he held on to his job, where he was buying himself Ferraris and condominiums, and I don't say that critically. I mean, I think taking a $100,000 donation to the Trump campaign and using it to buy a fancy car is a much more positive use, socially positive use of the money, than actually using it to so steal more. You're doing a good thing. But he kept his job for as long as he did and enabled his self-dealings by giving Trump false polls that made the election look closer than it was. And if the election is close, then these methods can work. In the face of the kind of tsunami that seems to be coming, then you just get overwhelmed and you can't do it. I mean, that you can do this at the margin. As Selena Meyer says in Veep, it's not much of a democracy, but it remains a democracy. And so in the end, the votes, if you get enough more votes, and the Trump people have no plan at all for a popular vote win. They only have a plan that if they can, how much worse can they do than last time? I think they lost by 2.8 million, 2.7 in the popular vote last time. How much worse can you do that and still eke it out in the Electoral College? That's the project.
Matt, can I just ask you, before we get to the sort of the restoring democracy in America part of this conversation, just will you weigh in, what's your view on what the reckoning has been, i.e. what you think has been, Matt wrote the book, you probably read it, David, on post-truth, and from an outsider's point of view, sitting here, one of the big issues here has been a sense of truth, justice, competence. I just wondered, Matt, when you look at the US and you were to make a reckoning of the 4 years of the Trump presidency, what would you say?
Well, I suppose the most interesting thing to me on that front is the extent to which I think Trump's victory solidified for me a fear that politics was becoming a branch of the entertainment industry. And I noticed someone in the chat comparing Trump to a wrestler, and of course he has actually been engaged in a WWE wrestling contest, which you can watch on YouTube, and famously appeared in lots of movies in cameo roles. And I think that fed into total disregard, which David, in both his books about Trump, has brought out brilliantly, for constitutional norms and a obsession with spectacle. And I guess the bookends in some respects are the argument, the initial argument over how many people attended his inauguration in 2017, which gave birth to the wonderful expression alternative facts. And then the row over the more recent rally, where he claimed that 1 million people had signed up, and I think only 6,000 turned up. And the image of him stepping off the plane, dejected, was the image of someone who is in showbiz and fears that his moment has passed, which is relevant to Trump himself, but also, of course, and this is where I'm sort of so fascinated in what David has to say, one wonders what the long-term corrosive impact upon the Republic will be. Because, I mean, just a final point, there's a wonderful, if rather lengthy, documentary about Watergate by Charles Ferguson, came out earlier I think last year. And there's a very striking moment in it where Bernstein recalls that he and Bob Woodward, the day that Nixon resigned in August '74, sort of retreated to a room just off the Washington Post newsroom and watched the resignation. And Bernstein described their awe that in spite of everything, the system had worked. And I guess the question that arises from all this, and David has some fantastic proposals and ideas for the way forward, is if the system works by dislodging Trump in November, what more work needs to be done to ensure that there isn't a repetition of this? Not in the sense that there isn't a repetition of a populist Republican president, but there isn't a repetition of a presidency that is so ungrounded in a commitment to the founding principles of the Republic. And I think that the question that to me is even more important than is it a one-term or a two-term presidency, is how lasting is the damage? How fundamental is it?
Well, let me pick up on that point, because this is the thing that moves me the most. And I want to say, first of all, I remain a registered Republican. I remain a conservative person. I remain someone whose sympathies are broadly with conservative parties all over the Western world. And I'm certainly not a person of the left. But here's if Trump loses, many Republicans are going to be very ready for a message of, he had a terrible work ethic, he was a goofball, he had no message discipline, he was lazy, and they might even be open to the idea, you know what, he wasn't very ethical and he should not have been doing all of that self-dealing and stealing and all of that. So the lesson they will take from the future, so we need to find someone who's harder working, more disciplined, and maybe less of a criminal. That would be good. But they will not take the larger lesson of that the core evil here, and this is the thing that the divisions that arise within modern society in the post-financial crisis era, which ought to be looked at as problems. The Republican Party uniquely has looked at them as resources and has exploited them in order to leverage a minority of support into a majority of political power. In order to have a Republican Party in a conservative world that can govern and govern in a socially useful way, they have to jettison that idea and become truly competitive. And you have to remove from them the option of limiting tacitly and covertly and clandestinely and informally. Maybe there's an argument that people who earn less than such and such an amount of money, or you're younger than this. Maybe that the old anti-democratic argument of the 19th century, maybe that's true. But if it is true, then do it formally, do it in law, let everyone know, and don't do it in a sly way with favoring some and disfavoring others. So I want to build a stronger sense of unity. And one more thing about the resource, and since this is a media company, I think this is a different kind of media company. This may be a point that's relevant here. Matt talked about things being post-truth. We were all very mesmerized by the flow of disinformation through Facebook. But one of the things I have really been impressed with as I've worked on this is how much of the false news problem is a demand side and not a supply side problem. The single most circulated false story of 2016 was a story that purported to come from a local TV station saying that Pope Francis had endorsed Donald Trump. Now, I'm not a Catholic, but if I were Catholic enough to care about who the Pope would endorse, I would be Catholic enough to know that the Pope never endorses anybody. The story could not be true. And any Catholic serious enough to care would know that the Pope didn't endorse John F. Kennedy, the Pope didn't endorse Al Smith, the Pope doesn't endorse governors, it didn't endorse Mario Cuomo, the Pope doesn't, in the modern era, popes don't endorse. They stay out of electoral politics, and every Catholic knows that. And yet hundreds of thousands of Catholics moved that piece among themselves and took pleasure by it and were evidently influenced by it. Why? Because they wanted to believe it, even though at some deep level they knew it wasn't true. And the way media systems like the BBC in Britain, like the prestige press in the United States used to deal with this problem, saying, look, we know there's a demand for fake news. It's going to be met by nasty printed newsletters or things that look extreme, but the prestige media are not going to slake that demand for fake news. But Facebook has discovered, actually, it's a better business to provide fake news. Fake news is cheaper to produce and gets more engagement than real news. So it's a much better business model to tell people lies than to tell people the truth.
David, I'm going to bring in a few other people, and I want to come into the beginning to think about this question about restoring democracy. But a number of people have got questions just on the race and what's happening in 2020. Daniel Dipper, I was going to come in, and then Umar Hassan is there. Daniel, do you want to weigh in first?
Hello. So yeah, my question is about basically how do we make America slightly less partisan? Because don't get me wrong, I think a strong opposition is important. I think, in the UK, Keir Starmer was giving a bit more opposition to the government than we had from the previous leader. But I've seen some kind of stories circulated online saying that in America, the mask wearing is even more partisan than it is over here. And that actually kind of wearing a mask is kind of like saying, I'm a Democrat voter, or I'm a Democrat. And it actually kind of intimidates people from wearing masks. So how do we kind of dial that down a little in America?
This is not going to, I'm going to quote a very smart paper by a political scientist who observed, the United States is a country of strong partisanship, but weak parties. So the mask is a perfect example. I mean, how do you get people, how do you make it's either a good idea or it's not. It either helps with the disease or it doesn't. If it helps, left, right, center, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, we all get sick and we all want to, we all wear a coat when it's cold. We all use an umbrella when it's raining. It's not an ideological thing to use an umbrella. The mask has become one, and that's because of our strong partisanship. But we have weak parties in that what didn't happen was that there was some meeting where the Republicans agreed that the mask would become a partisan symbol. Instead, what happened was Donald Trump interpreted the mask as a criticism, and then it sort of flowed from Trump to Fox News and other conservative media, and Republican politicians then found themselves trapped. I mean, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who is not an idiot, wants to be president. His plan was to be a successful governor of Florida, get reelected in 2022, and then be candidate for president in 2024. And one of the reasons he looks so crazy when you see him on TV is he understands that plan has been completely smashed by the terrible death toll in Florida. He will not be reelected. He will not be president. He's not an idiot. He would know. He was able to hear the advice, but he was trapped by the partisanship of his own followers. He didn't give an order to them. They created an environment in which he had to reopen his state, make fun of masks, not take this thing seriously, and destroy his own career.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daniel. Thanks very much, Umar. Umar Hassan, are you there? Yeah, I see. Yeah. So, hello there.
Hello there. Hello, James. Hello, David. I think one of the things that I've sort of seen with the Trump presidency is how all, I call it the WWE-ification of politics, particularly in America, because I know that Trump is heavily backed by combat sports promoter Dana White as well as Vince McMahon. And I'm wondering how much of this sort of WWE-ification, as I call it, has sort of fragmented politics in a way that Trump portrays himself as the face, and then he portrays the Democrat as the heel, the bad guy. So I'm just wondering how this sort of issue between good and evil just seems to be going on, because it kind of feels as if it's like one big fight, but there's so many different sort of variables going on at the moment that are quite easy to recognize, and it kind of makes politics even more toxic than it is.
Yeah, the Trump loves playing. Yeah, as you say, he's got this affiliation with WWE, and he made a video of himself. He's used some of his WWE videos as images in his social media, making himself look like a super manly. I mean, it's a weird. I mean, Donald Trump is probably, I've written, he's the least physically fit president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his wheelchair, and he's overweight. He can't lift a ball. And he's white. I mean, he said he could not be a less manly figure. He's whiny. He wears makeup all the time. And he gets upset easily. I mean, whatever your stereotype of classic masculine behavior, he does the opposite. Mm-hmm. But he is full of rage and grievance. And this thing about WWE gets to it. One of the fault lines in American society that I talk about in the book is that between, and not just our society, every democracy, men and women, among people under 30, never in the history of statistics have people under 30 been less likely to live with a spouse or partner than they are now. In fact, young people under 30 are more likely to live with a parent than with a married spouse. And this is just unheard of. It goes back to the boarding days of the 19th century. So you have a lot of, and by the way, this behavior is repeated in the people even older because of divorces. More and more people living alone. When men and women live alone, they become different sociocultural groups, and you get a lot of mutual mistrust. You get separation. You get separate interests rather than the combined interests. And in men, you get a lot of rage and aggression, and it expresses itself in radical politics. The alt-right is about is about sexuality much more than it is about race, in my opinion. I make that argument in the book. And Trump speaks to angry, disaffected men and offers a vision of masculinity that is very much the image of masculinity of a country where people sit on the couch a lot, because he ain't Teddy Roosevelt going out into the thickets and hunting wild rams. He's not Gerald Ford swooshing down the ski hill. He is a giant whiny complainer, and there are a lot of people who respond to that.
Let me pick up on that, David. Actually, I'm going to ask Anil to come in, because this goes back to this question. And I see that Mehdi Asghari is making this point too, which is, where does he sit in this sort of history and the threads of Republican leadership? Mehdi Asghari is asking actually an extent to which, you and George W. Bush set the Republican Party on a different track. And Anil is asking about, if you like, sort of resistance movements within the Republican Party. And you'll make the point better than I will, so why don't you come in?
Thanks. I just wanted David's view of the sort of likely success of the anti-Republican groups like the Republican Voters Against Trump and the Lincoln Project, the latter of which in particular seems to have got under his skin successfully, frankly, by taking the piss out of him, and which has been hugely entertaining. But I just wondered how much traction they actually have amongst the Republican base.
Yeah, well, the importance of the Lincoln Project ads, I don't believe they move a single vote. I mean, the Lincoln Project ads are aimed at the highly online, the highly politically engaged, exactly the kind of people who are not influenced by advertising. But what they've done, and Mehdi, you said this, is what Lincoln Project has done is gotten inside Trump's business decision cycle. So the president has no more hours in his day than anybody else. And even someone who's on whatever medications or drugs Trump is on still has to sleep sometimes. And there are only so many days to the election day. And every day you're doing something dumb, or every hour you're doing something dumb is an hour you're not doing something smart. And so the Lincoln people have driven him, and Trump has got objectively very bad facts, so he has to really play his cards very well. And they've driven him to make mistake after mistake after mistake, to be distracted, to get upset, to talk about the wrong things when he should be talking about the right things. So they've messed with his head, and in politics, that especially, it might matter less if Trump allowed the professionals to run his campaign, but he doesn't do that either. And they have to take dollars, which they're going to need, and waste them putting on ads in Washington, D.C., so that Trump sees them and gets calmed down. But I think it is true that Trump's position within the Republican world is melting. Many of the people are re-identifying. Like, if you want to belong to a party in the UK, you actually have to, like, as I understand it, go to a website, check a box, pay some money, enter your name in a mailing list. There's a formal act. We don't have that in the United States. A Republican, you can register as a Republican, yes, as I do, but most of the people who, when we make comments about Republicans, are people who, when the pollster calls and asks, do you identify as a Democrat or Republican, say Republican. And so someone can be a Republican before lunch and an independent after lunch, depending on their feeling. So Trump gets his support among Republicans because so many people are re-identifying emotionally as non-Republicans. And you can see that with the drift away from him among groups like college-educated women, and now even among college-educated men. Last thing, I think this is a question that James spoke of for Mayday, that he didn't say in the question, which is Trump situated in history. The way I see this is Trump is both the product, something in time, the product of events before him in American history, but he's also situated in space, in different countries. There are Trumps all over the world. So when you're trying to explain Trump, you cannot use just American history to explain him, because the same things have to be used to explain Brexit, to explain the National Front in France, the AfD in Germany, Orban and the PIS. So they come from the same places. Bolsonaro, and even in some of the advancing or emerging democracies, Mexico and Brazil, you see Trump-like behaviors. So there's something going on that is specifically American, for sure, but something that is going on that is pretty common across the developed world.
Thank you, David, and thanks for responding both to Anil, to your point and to the point Mehdi made in the chat. I want to bring in Stephen Gilchrist, because he's raised a point in the chat about checks and balances. Before I do, I just want to talk about the democratic system. One person made the point about the Electoral College, and there was a moment, not so long ago, when that seemed as though it was in play. Listening to you talk about where voting booths are and aren't put, what your rights are as a citizen of the United States, how much do you think there is a real movement for a revisiting of the rules of the electoral system within the United States?
Well, we have a whole battery of rules of different degrees of persistence. Like the Electoral College is in the Constitution. So whether it's a good idea or not, it's extremely hard to get rid of. And people have workarounds, like there's this electoral pact where a state would commit that if enough other states agree that that state will cast its electoral votes for the popular vote winner. Those aren't very workable, because the Electoral College tends to empower smaller states, and it tends to empower states where one party has, and it tends to empower competitive states. And anyway, I don't know that it's going anywhere. But we have a lot of other problems that are easier to resolve. And many of the worst of them show up at the state level that gets less attention. So let me just give you an example. In the 2018 election, in the state of Wisconsin, a northern state, not a southern state, the Republicans won 45% of the votes. The two houses of the Wisconsin state legislature have 99 seats, and Republicans got 64 out of 99 seats. That's not because of the Electoral College, and that's nothing to do with federal rules. That Wisconsin drew its boundaries in a way that allowed 45% of the votes to translate into almost 2/3 of the political power in two houses. And that has to do with changes that could be, with rules that could be changed by law. You could redistrict the states more fairly. You could bring back the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court weakened in 2013. The Supreme Court ruled in 2019 that partisan gerrymandering is okay, but what is forbidden is racial gerrymandering. But of course, in the United States, party and race overlap. So when you do partisan gerrymandering, of course you overdo racial gerrymandering. It's striking, by the way, that the state where the Supreme Court approved partisan gerrymandering was Wisconsin. And one of the reasons that this case was brought in Wisconsin is Wisconsin is a place where there remain enough white Democrats that the gerrymander could disempower Democrats and affect whites and blacks together. But in most states other than Wisconsin, when you do partisan gerrymandering, you're gerrymandering or disadvantaging people of one group or another, white or black or minorities or majorities. So we can address many of those things, and we'll have a chance. We have a census in 2020 and a redistricting in 2021. If Democrats win enough governorships in 2020, then they can put some power into the game of saying, let's not do such extreme gerrymandering. One of the reasons we're in the trouble we're in is 2010, the Republicans won hugely at the state level because of the terrible recession. And they then did things with the 2010 census that were much more extreme than had been done before. This is not a new practice, but the 2010 gerrymandering was the most extreme we've seen since the 60s, I think.
David, thank you. I'm gonna bring in Stephen Gilchrist, and then I've got a few other thoughts. Stephen.
Yes, hi James, and hi David. I think that from this side of the pond, we see things rather more simplistically than you do. Perhaps you see the trees, we look at the wood. That may give us a correct or incorrect perception of what's actually going on. But it does seem to me that the American electorate, for whatever reason, have elected somebody who is a misogynist, he's a bully, he's dishonest, he's a moron. But the fact of the matter is he was elected. So, one has to get on with it. That's the voting system that we have in the Western world. But when it comes to exercising his power, wouldn't you agree that really the checks and balances within the Republic have actually worked to a large extent? Okay, he's had his way. He's put a couple of judges, hasn't he, in the Supreme Court, conservative judges. He managed to resist conviction on impeachment, and that's politics. But by and large, there's been quite a large pushback, hasn't there? By I would suggest by both the civil service, if you like, what we would call the civil service within the White House, and by the courts, by the general administration to restrict his power. He hasn't acted he hasn't been able to act in a sort of manic way. He hasn't blown the world up. He says the most outrageous things, but actually what he's done has been fairly restrictive, I think, and that may be because of the checks and balances within the system. I just wondered what you thought about that.
Well, I strenuously disagree with that, and I have a whole chapter about why I think that's mistaken. And I won't recapitulate all that now, but let me just make a couple of points. I think one of the things that happens is people tend to set the bar too low. As you say, he hasn't blown up the world, and of course we're grateful for that. But what he has done is refused to accept any subpoenas from Congress, and he's refused to deliver to let his people testify before Congress, or at least the House of Representatives, where his friends aren't in control. That's a constitutional revolution. With the courts, one of the sentences that appears in one of the first major articles I read about Donald Trump, it's reiterated in my first book, Trumpocracy, and again in Trumpocalypse, because I think this is really a master key to understanding it. There's something that was said to me when I visited Hungary in 2016. A lot of my reporting with Trump starts with this visit I made to Hungary in the spring of 16. This person who was a shrewd observer of Hungarian politics said, look, Hungary's a member of the EU, it's bound by the European Human Rights Convention, it answers ultimately to the European Court of Justice. What could Orban do? And the answer is, in a state like Hungary, and like Britain, like the United States, what the threat to freedom isn't the use of the law to persecute the innocent. That's impossible. It's very, very difficult. The power comes from using the law to protect the guilty. So Donald Trump has been taking bribes. He has some obvious, but its dimensions exact unknown relationship with the Russian state that's very disturbing. He tried to blackmail the Ukrainian state. He tried to induce the Chinese state to help him. And by the way, he was quite successful in many of these enterprises. But the full dimensions of what happened, to some degree, they're not known, and to the extent they're unknown, they have gone unreproved because Trump has been able to use the powers of the presidency to protect himself. The fact is, the president's taking bribes every day. He's taking, he's
David,
moving money.
David, sorry. What do you mean when you make an assertion like that? What do you mean?
What I mean is, the president has streams of payments that come from foreign persons and foreign governments to him personally. When the Saudi government spends over the course of the past years $1 million at Trump properties, are they doing it because the Trump Hotel is the nicest hotel in Washington? When the Kushner family gets bailed out of a desperately struggling, unsuccessful business deal in New York's Fifth Avenue by Qatari investors, is that done on the merits? When Donald Trump, when every company that wants to do business with Donald Trump gets asked by the president, where did you stay last night? And when the Trump Hotel consistently passed dramatically higher prices and lower reservation rates than comparable hotels in Washington, the president is receiving money. He's operating a business, and we know very little about the internal workings of that business because the president has been able to meet disclosure requirements. So all of those, every day there's something that happens that would, in other times, be an enormous scandal. The president just yesterday posted an image of himself at the Resolute desk in the Oval Office with a line of products from Goya Beans, a company that has given him money and endorsed him. That's illegal, actually. At this point, it's like the least of our problems that we don't care, but it is illegal. It's a crime for a federal employee to use government time and government money to promote private businesses. And so I think part of it is that we've all lost our perspective in the Trump years about what is scandalous and what is not. Since yes, it's true, he hasn't blown up the world. He hasn't tortured any American citizens. We do not see the suppression of independent media, although there have been attempts. He's not been able to use all federal agencies in the way that he would like, but he's done things that would just, if they were done in Britain, your head would explode. And the mechanisms for constraining that, which are above all Congress, have failed.
David, thank you. Candida Watson made a point, and I wanted to put it to you. Candida, are you there? Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hello.
I've unmuted myself.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, David. I wanted to ask you. There's a very noticeable difference between the way that the American media approaches Trump and, for example, the British media approach leading politicians. And I wondered whether you felt, as I do, that the American media is very deferential to the office of the president, and therefore they don't call him out as much as they might because they're respecting the office. So he goes out into the Rose Garden and he frankly talks nonsense for more than an hour, and they don't pick him up on it. They don't cut away from him. They just sit there.
Yeah. Well, there are some important differences between the British media in the United States. And one of them, this is not original to me, I'm sure many people are, is that American, this is a little out of date, but in the olden days, American newspapers did what British television does, and British television does and British newspapers do what American television does. So our newspapers, our print media are the more respectable media, and our TV is more demonic. It is true, the office of the presidency there's no office like it in the democratic world. That Hank Paulson, in his memoirs of his time at Treasury, told the story that in 2008, he got a call from the White House inviting him to come down to Washington to see the president. And at the time he was chief operating officer, he was the number 2 at Goldman Sachs, and he spent some time trying to postpone the meeting because he knew that what would happen is if he accepted the meeting, he would have to go to Washington, he would go to the Oval Office, he would meet the president, and the president would ask him to be Secretary of the Treasury. And if the president asked him, he would have to say yes. Now, I don't think anybody in Britain feels like if Boris Johnson asks you to do something, you have to say yes, or Tony Blair. I mean, that's something. People say no to the prime minister all the time, and they're not even that polite about it. But the president, when the president asks you to do something, you have to do it. He's the king. He's the king as well as the prime minister. Mm-hmm. And when we have a mad king, it's so upsetting that the media and the prestige media in particular have problems coping with it. One other thing that is also part of the story, though, is the media have their own bargains, and they're not totally admirable. And CNN, the media you probably see most often, is the worst, which is they're concerned about sources. Yeah. They are also, I'm afraid, they enjoy the drama of it all. Trump has been particularly good for CNN because CNN, although it's a more respected product, it's actually not a very good quality product. It's both. It aspires to be the centrist, but it's also actually you will learn less from an hour of CNN than you will from an hour of MSNBC or even an hour of Fox. And it's a much more rock'em sock'em environment. And so Trump is good for them. But we do have a mad king, and it's scary.
David, I just want to make sure Louise Simpson has just got a question, which I suppose is one that's on all of our minds. It's about just how much he can cling on to the presidency or disrupt the election, and I just want to make sure that was asked before we're done. Louise, are you there? Hello.
Yeah, absolutely. Given the fact that you're saying, actually, you've just said that he is using the power of the presidency to protect himself, that just adds another dimension into his desire to hold power in whatever way. From all the examples you've given, this man is a criminal. So what do you think is going to stop him finding some criminal way of winning the presidency?
So here are the danger points from the election on. One is the Trump people, as this has been reported, are already thinking about ways to find, is there some way that they could agree to postpone the election? The dates of the election are set by a complex system of federal and state law. And there is a little bit of leeway in emergency conditions, and we are in an emergency, to postpone election dates. I think Trump will also try to tamper with voting by mail and create situations in which people have to risk their health in order to vote against him. And this is going to be an especial problem, given that minority people and urban people are more at risk from the virus. Trying to take away the option of voting by mail is something that Trump believes helps him, and he's probably right about that. If the vote happens on time, and if the vote is recorded against Donald Trump, here are his options. The real danger point: the election is the first Tuesday in November. The next important date on the calendar is the 6th of December. On that date, in the state capitals, the governors of the state form a law, certify the vote from their state, and they pick. Remember, the Electoral College it's not just a phrase; it's actually people. So a state like Michigan has 16 electors. So there are two slates. There's a Republican slate of 16 people and a Democratic slate of 16 people. And this is normally a pretty honorific. These are county chairs. It's an honorific thing because the winners get to go to Washington on expense with their expenses paid by the state government and go to the Smithsonian and have their pictures taken. It's nice. But in states that are close, if there's a Republican governor, the governor has some option to sort of refuse to either certify one, say, I think actually the Democrats didn't win, I think the Republicans did, and to try to certify one, or to postpone it, or to evade the certification. So December 6th will be a very consequential date. Some governors may choose to duck the issue and send two slates to Washington and let Washington sort it out. The next important date is January the 6th. At that point, the slates of electors, Democrat or Republican, or if there's a state that sends both come to Washington, and they convene under the chairmanship of the vice president, like the sitting vice president, and they cast their electoral votes. And this is usually a total formality. But Mike Pence then may have some opportunity to do mischief on January the 6th. I think the December 6th date is much more consequential and significant and ominous than the January 6th, just because it's more invisible. There's more opportunity for mischief. But once we get past those two dates, then Donald Trump can't do anything. Once it's certified, because the inauguration date is in the Constitution, that's the 20th of January at noon. And if Donald Trump has not been certified, he's not president anymore. So even if he says, I'm not leaving the White House, now we have a landlord-tenant problem. But he's not president. The guy with the nuclear football wanders off. The Joint Chiefs don't take his calls. No one will do anything. The power leaves him. So his mischief are those two moments with the state and federal elector meetings to try to create confusion and muddiness. And maybe, and I think this may be to present Biden with a deal, which is, look, I'll go away quietly if you undertake to protect me and my family from legal consequence.
Mm-hmm. You're right. David, thank you. Because we started a couple of minutes late, I'm going to do one thing I almost never do, which is ask a question right here, which is the very last one. You said at the start that you were, or earlier on, that you were a registered Republican, that you're a conservative, you're not a person of the left. I just wanted to ask you, in the light of what's happened with the coronavirus, who we see suffer, who we've seen die from this illness, and the sense that the disease doesn't discriminate, but it shows the extent to which our society does. I wonder how much this has challenged your thinking, because the mechanism of that inequality and the way in which it's been meted out in this pandemic is the marketplace, and is something that's such a tenet of Republicans and conservatives. And I wondered whether or not this has in any way fundamentally challenged your belief in capitalism and the marketplace.
You know, markets are tools, and the question is, you know, how do you use them? What rules do they have to comply? And for me, you earlier mentioned that I talked in the book about progressive reform, and in the book I distinguish between two traditions in America: progressive with a capital P and progressive with a lowercase p. I don't know if this is an English vocabulary. Probably it isn't. So progressive with a lowercase p means the agenda of the ideological left, more social democracy. In the United States, progressive with a capital P has been an agenda of building state capacity, making our government less corrupt, more efficient, more effective. And I think what we need is, what I'm concerned about is state capacity. And I think that's the thing that has really been exposed. You know, actually, in many ways, this virus has been an incredible vindication of the achievements of the capitalist economy. I mean, we have shut down a third of our economy. Now, at other points in human history, if you shut down a third of the economy, people just starve to death. Mm-hmm. And even 50 years ago, if you shut down a third of the economy, people would be cast into want and destitution. But because of the extraordinary wealth of enterprise societies, we're able to, and because of the sophistication of our capital markets, we can say, let's borrow trillions of dollars from the future and use it to keep people eating. And the future believes we're going to pay it back because the societies have developed such extraordinary, I mean, and it's a vindication of John Maynard Keynes's observation about capitalist societies, that when you have a market society, anything you can afford, anything you can technically do, you can afford to do. It's just a matter of the financing. So I think this is a tremendous achievement of market societies. What we've had, especially in the United States, is a tremendous failure of state capacity, where how difficult is it to issue a $35 ticket to everybody on the street not wearing a mask? You should be able to do that. If we're spending trillions, we can afford to have enough, you know, special police officers say, you're not wearing a mask, here's a $35 ticket, you must pay. And if you did that, you would get the mask wearing up. You know, many of the inequities we see because of the mismanagement of nursing homes and prisons. Again, these are questions of state capacity. Yeah. And America, dollar for dollar, has the least effective government in the developed world. I've long believed that. We don't have a proper civil service. And so we spend almost as much as a European state, but get way less value for that money. And so where my mind is going is to say that the great project for the 2020s and 2030s is not social democracy, it's state building, it's state capacity.
Okay, David, thank you. Well, I'm really glad we got to that. That is a rousing thought to end with. I'm not going to try and summarize what you said, except to say two simple things. One, it is really frightening how I was leaning in almost on the edge of my seat as you were describing December the 6th, January the 6th, the possibility of a United States where someone is trying to cling to power and no president has been certified. Even the idea that we were talking about that is just mind-boggling. And the second thing is that the final things you said about state capacity and building of that state capacity is so interesting in the second half of the book. I just encourage everyone to go out and go and get Trumpocalypse, because I think that's going to be the really interesting conversation for 2021, is whoever comes in, what's going to be the nature of the United States in the 2020s. And I very much hope you'll come back and we can talk about it again in the future. We can't give you a round of applause or even buy you a drink, but we can sort of wave merrily in your direction. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been fascinating.
Best to all across the Atlantic. Bye-bye.
Cheers.